watching Town Talk, and joining me today is Planning and Development Director Elizabeth Jenkins, and we're going to talk all things form-based code and zoning. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me, Sarah.
So this is a big topic of conversation. I think we want to help people understand with this interview. So let's start with form-based code. What does that mean?
Sure. So form-based code is a sort of new practice in the planning industry that updates traditional ways of doing zoning to think more about not just regulating the use that goes along with land use, but goes along with regulating the form and placement of buildings. So we all know that zoning is the primary way that municipalities have to regulate land use in their community. And for a long time, zoning in its traditional form, the primary way it was organized was around use. And that's a good thing. We want to be able to have tools in our land use planning toolbox to be able to keep uses that are incompatible with each other away from each other. But it's not a very nuanced way to create great places.
Right.
So over time, there were other sort of tools that got added to traditional zoning, and those are things that we planners call dimensional requirements, but that I'm sure everybody is familiar with. Their setback regulations or density regulations or floor area ratios. But again, these are largely designed to be fairly static tools and not necessarily taking into account the specifics of a place and what makes it special. So form-based code was something that evolved out of the limitations of traditional zoning, really to focus less on use as an organizing principle and more on form, to be able to encourage buildings to be more reflective of the environment in which they're in, and to really focus on the way buildings on a private lot respond to the public space that's around them, the streets and the streetscapes.
Right. So we have form-based code in a very specific part of Hyannis. Can you talk about what that area looks like?
That's correct. So in March of 2020, our town council adopted a comprehensive revision to the zoning ordinances that are in place for the area that we call Downtown Hyannis, and we think of from a regulatory perspective as our growth incentive zone. So this is the area of downtown where we're trying to promote new growth and investment, because it's where we have public infrastructure, because it's where we have the building blocks of a great walkable place here on Cape Cod. And one of the things that we kept hearing was that really to increase that vibrancy, we needed to increase that year-round presence, and what better way to do it than with additional housing. And we were getting some great proposals in and some great interest in new housing developments. But what we saw was that under our traditional zoning, again, that's regulating setbacks, that's regulating units per acre, that's regulating use, it wasn't allowing for the sort of smaller, versatile types of development, specifically housing development, that I think Hyannis could really benefit from, and that would meet our housing needs, that so-called missing middle housing type. Mm-hmm. It's not the big apartment complex, and it's not the single family home. It's all of those pieces in between that tend to get overlooked when you have traditional zoning. So we were looking for ways in downtown Hyannis to encourage the more versatile use of property, and that's how we got to moving away from this idea that a property can only have so many units per acre, but let's think about what a site can accommodate. Let's think about how to make the best use of what's there. And a lot of the times, the best use for what's there is definitely more housing downtown.
I think a good example of that is on North Street is the Baxter Nye office building. That is now going to be 11 apartment units. I think that's a good example of how this form-based code works.
Yeah, that's a great example of a property that otherwise could have never been converted over to housing, going to be 11 new housing units. It's fantastic. And, that's a good example too, because they needed some flexibility on how they complied with parking requirements. And, ended up having to go to a public hearing, talk it out with the planning board. So it was sort of the full look at how that process can work and the flexibility that's, again, built into the code.
Yeah. How do you balance traditional zoning with this format? Because you talked about how traditional zoning, keeps two things that are very different away from each other. So you want to think of like you're not going to have heavy machinery zone in a residential area. So like, how do you balance traditional zoning with form-based code?
So a couple of things. I do think it's important to recognize, although we call the tool in Hyannis at work a form-based code, there are ways that can go much further and tend to be more prescriptive in terms of what gets built. But it really was one of the objectives of that effort to, again, allow that flexibility and that flexible use of buildings. The other thing I think that's important to point out is, we talk about it as a form-based code, but that doesn't mean it doesn't regulate use. It just puts an additional emphasis on form. We do still have a full use table. You can see it in the ordinance. It's actually a single page now, though very sort of easy to access and understand. So we are still looking at different uses downtown, what we think belongs where, how to activate that first floor public realm along the core of Main Street. Those things are all still included. It's just now we have those additional standards that relate to building form and placement to give us more predictability in terms of what gets built. It's sort of a trade-off. If we want to have less time and less steps in our review process, we knew we had to be a lot more careful in terms of how we wrote the code so we could be meeting those expectations.
Right.
So your question was, how do you balance the traditional zoning and the form-based zoning? And I think that's one way that we do still focus on use. The other thing that I think is important to talk about here is the fact that if our community and if other communities are looking at doing that, really thinking about the fundamentals of your place. What makes the community unique? What makes it special? What are the types of building forms that you want to see going forward that maybe that traditional zoning has produced? What's working well and what's not working well? So really thinking about the specifics of an area, that sort of traditional neighborhood character. In the case of Hyannis Main Street, that historic character and our ability to regulate further in terms of what historic buildings get preserved and exactly how they look like. And this all got fit together into the form-based code.
What does the regulatory process look like for someone who is, looking at Downtown Hyannis? What steps do they have to take in order to fit into this kind of new zoning
Great
area?
question. And I think probably the best answer is go talk to your planning department.
Right.
they'll lay it out for you.
Right.
But in broad strokes, again, one of the objectives of the zoning was continued permit streamlining. That was something that we had been hearing for a long time, is that, the more predictability you can put into a project, the more likely somebody is going to start looking at it.
Right. If they know what they can do.
If they know what they can do. Even if what you're asking them to do is more, they're more willing to do more if they know they can make it to the end, if they know that there is a predictable end outcome. So there are many options in the code that if you comply with it by the letter, it can produce by right projects, by right mixed use and multifamily projects. And we say by right, but that does include a comprehensive review by our site plan review committee and our police and our fire and our Department of Public Works to make sure you are meeting all of the codes. And bigger projects always have to go through what we call formal site plan review,
right,
which does have a public component. Nobody wants to be surprised by a big change that's coming right next to them. So for larger projects, there is that for what we call formal site plan review with the public notice. So
right, I was going to say, like, a butter notices go out.
Exactly,
yes,
for the big projects, at least so folks who are nearby have a chance to be informed about what's happening and coming through the permit pipeline. And then again, the idea was flexibility. So if there are sort of different things that necessarily might not be fitting in terms of that letter, because again, we wanted to be really prescriptive. Those things can go to the planning board but again, that's additional review and a special permit process.
Is there somewhere that people can find all of this information? I know we probably have it on the website somewhere, but I'm going to give you the opportunity to let people know that.
We do. Thank you. Actually, we try to keep a comprehensive resource for folks who are looking at investing in Downtown Hyannis. On the Planning and Development Department page, we have a button on there, and it says Downtown Hyannis, and it includes not just the new zoning code and the development regulations, but also the associated design guidelines that are being worked on through this, and a number of the other projects that we're working on downtown. I think it's important to know that when we talk about wanting to, add new housing to Downtown Hyannis, we're not just talking about encouraging development. We're doing this project in the context of a fantastic effort to try to look at our entire transportation network and make it flow more efficiently. Our Great Streets Downtown Hyannis project, we're kicking off a project that looks at some of our big open spaces, including the Village Green, and how to redesign that and activate that. So we sort of created a clearinghouse for all of these different projects. And again, that's the Downtown Hyannis button on the Planning and Development Department page, where people can see the zoning, but also see
everything
the
else.
Context as well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in Downtown Hyannis. Is there any plans for any some of this kind of zoning in other parts of the town, or are we kind of just focusing on Hyannis right now?
Yeah, so we've done that project, and at this point, we know there's a lot of community conversation about zoning and housing. There are no projects that are in the works right now. We're certainly listening to our community and seeing how we can best use our policy tools to respond to the housing that we need, but also to make sure that we are protecting the character of the entire town of Barnstable and keeping this place special.
That's great. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure we talk about? Or
I think that's all. I mean, we would love the opportunity to show off some of these great projects. Maybe we could put a little slideshow together that you guys can display. But thank you for taking the time and talking about zoning with me.
It's not my forte, but I'm figuring it out, just like you all are. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Sarah.